In today's video, we are chatting with board game designer Volko Ruhnke about his upcoming title, Drachen. It is the second volume in his Recon series, this time focusing on the Battle of Verdun. Let's get a bird's eye view of what he's up to. This is Legendary Tactics. Throughout your career, sort of, watching the games you've been designing and experiencing them, it seems like you glom onto a theme. So it'll be like coin, and then it'll be levy and campaign, and now it seems to be intelligence and
Recon series.
recon, so forth.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think Draken is perhaps the pinnacle of the system? Is that how you see it, or
No,
okay?
it's volume
Good to know.
two.
Okay.
Yeah. So the only way that Drachen is likely, let's say, to be the pinnacle of anything is, if I pass from the scene and nobody else is interested enough to keep on with the series, so that's possible, I guess, but it's certainly not my plan. So I know what volumes 3 and 4 in the Recon series are highly likely to be, and I have a concept at least for volume 5. And my, you know, hope, gosh, I work at this, so I hope this is true that I'm learning. Therefore, I'm getting better with each design, right? And I might go back in a series and say, well, this one, has a special place in my heart because of something or whatever. But I do feel that from my point of view, we got, better as we went, right? And that's no aspersion on the folks who are involved in the earlier volumes. It's just, we're hopefully version 3 of something with the same theme is better, and we've worked out some kinks, right? We've tightened the bolts on the machine, and it runs more to smoother to our liking or whatever. So Drachen is volume 2. And I really hope it will not be the last Recon series volume to reach market. And
Yeah.
unless something happens to me, it almost certainly won't be.
And what do you think you took from Coast Watchers that you were then able to, or even Blackbeard? I guess Blackbeard was maybe volume
Mm-hmm.
0.5 or whatever it
Kind of,
was.
if you think of how Labyrinth relates to the Coin series, there's like similar genealogical track from Hunt for Blackbeard to Coast Watchers. And so Coast Watchers very much focuses on intelligence and counterintelligence. And the combat that's in it is, so Japanese security patrols are somewhat abstractly chasing down coast watching stations. And so there's combat. There were skirmishes in the jungles that related to that. But it's more it's more hide and seek, really, than it is, shooting. And then the Japanese are going to launch some operations that end the game, and you track where Japanese airstrikes and naval expeditions, sorties sail. But you do that for the purpose of intelligence. You do that to see whether the Coast Watchers network does a good job or a poor job providing tactical warning. And and that's it. That's the game. You're scoring the intelligence versus security struggle, rather than you never find out, well, how well did the bombing go, when the Japanese flew down to Guadalcanal or whatever, right? That's not really the scope of the game. So in Drachen, I don't know if this is so much my learning as it is just what is it that we're trying to show. What is the game about? What are the dynamics? So what Drachen is trying to get at is the role of reconnaissance at the operational level in trench warfare, using Verdun as the case study. And to do that, um, there's an ongoing reconnaissance battle, mostly in the air over the trenches, but not entirely. But while that battle is going on, there's like a hide and seek going on between artillery batteries as well. And and to play that out, and that's all happening ahead of the big moment is the offensive. So just like in the end of Coast Watchers, there's usually going to be one or more Japanese operations launched that the Coast Watchers are attempting to warn against. In Drachen, at the end, almost always, the attacking side, whichever is the side that's got the wherewithal to be on the offensive at Verdun, is going to launch its offensive, is going to launch its infantry assaults to try to actually capture some ground, probably. And the premise of the game, Drachen, the historical premise, is that reconnaissance struggle was determinative. That if you won the reconnaissance battle, you could reasonably simulate the rest of the offensive deterministically.
Hmm.
Okay. And so Drachen, to tell that story, Drachen has to resolve combat, has to resolve the artillery, dueling, if you like, where you're trying to discover the other guy's batteries. But if you shoot at him, you're revealing your batteries, and he might then do counter battery fire. That's going on ahead of the big push. And then if we're going to determine, well, how well did you position for the big push? And how well did your reconnaissance inform your barrages, right? To basically, we have to do the push. But with that premise in hand, that the real decisive dynamism is in the reconnaissance struggle, if we accept that, then once the players have positioned their pieces accordingly, we can resolve the combat relatively simply, deterministically. Right? It's all a simplification, of course. It's not to say it's truly deterministic in the sense that there aren't random factors in actual combat and trench warfare. Of course, there are, but it's all a matter of what do we choose to simplify how much, because it's going to be something. And this is the Recon series. So if you don't buy the premise that reconnaissance was critical to the outcome of a trench offensive, you're probably not going to believe the model that's in Drachen. On the
Yeah.
other hand, I hope you'll try it out and let's see if the game convinces you. Right? Anyway.
Now, specifically, why Verdun? And what was
Hmm.
it about Verdun that allowed you to build this model?
So there are two reasons, historical and personal, one historical and one personal. So historically, Verdun was a huge laboratory for trench warfare. And just a segue, the designer non-breaking space NB, they have a Verdun design. I don't know if you saw it at Circle DC.
No, I don't
Uh,
think I did.
okay, so it's called the Mordheim. It's very interesting. And it's a little more tactical than Drachen. But it is part of an envisioned series from them called Tactics to Doctrine, starting with the idea that in key battles and wars, armies tested tactics that then generated lasting doctrine. And looking at across history, where was a battle that exemplified that? They came up with Verdun. So to Verdun for the same reason that Drachen is at Verdun. And what about Recon? Well, Verdun was the first time that a side undertook an integrated plan to control the airspace over a sector for the purpose of denying the enemy the ability to carry out reconnaissance to make a surprise attack possible. And that involved integration of multiple elements, round the clock or daily barrier patrols to shut out the enemy, deep reconnaissance by zeppelins, balloons, of course, a counter balloon surprise attack at the beginning of it, everything. And so it's been written that Verdun was actually the first battle in which the term air forces really had the meaning we understand today. And that went on in terms of both sides, the French and the German, experimenting with their tactics and great aces names, Immelmann, Bölke, Gunnemer, Navarre are made over the trenches of Verdun. And in the World War One game ladder that your colleague recently did, that Flash recently did, I think he says in that video something like, we've not looked at World War One as much in war games, right? As World War Two, it's just been overshadowed, and that's absolutely true, which means there's a lot to be mined, for us
Yes, of
designers,
course.
right?
Yeah.
And in a way, even within that, I mean, we're Anglos, we tend to look at the British experience more
Yeah.
than, let's say, the French or the Russian or the Italian. And so Verdun, but from the French point of view, and this goes a little bit to me personally, I had on my on both sides of my family actually folks who served in ancestors who served in the German army. Okay.
Hmm.
And so very meaningfully in 1999, I did a little trip. I happened to be in Germany. I did a little train trip to Verdun to go visit that. And
Hmm.
it's like, I don't know what site is like this for Canada. Is it
Vimy Ridge.
Vimy? Right. For the French, I would say, for like a US counterpart would be Gettysburg. For the French seems to be Verdun because it's there with all the school buses coming in, field trips and everything, and it is just a remarkable. It's one of those places where the man-made history there has changed the way the land looks. It's really remarkable, just the shell holes everywhere that you can still see today, and the trenches and everything, and the fort remains, of course. Anyway, so very meaningful trip for me, way back when, and so I've always kind of personally been I've been very interested in trench warfare, in part because it is such an odd phenomenon that kept going with a different logic of its own for 4 years on the Western Front. Um, and under simulated in our hobby, as your colleague mentioned correctly. And Verdun in particular just holds this fascination of, a 10-month long attrition battle. Um, anyway, that turns out to have been a schoolhouse of not only how do we fight trench warfare, but how do we fight air war, which was almost entirely about reconnaissance.
And so does the game track that evolution of tactics? Do different things come into play at different times?
So a little bit in that there was a particular tactic that the French came up with that was highly impactful that the Germans a month later copied, and that is the original kind of practice of the fighter units was they were like individual knights of the air. Like they'd go out in an airplane, they'd look for trouble and duel their opponent and shoot them down, kind of thing, jousting style or whatever. The French figured out that if they grouped their fighters together in larger numbers and stuck together in formations, that they would be more effective plane for plane in defeating enemy fighters. And they implemented that in their first counteroffensive under Nivelle in June, May, I think. Anyway, and then it worked very well, and the Germans saw that, and by the next German push coming back, the Germans started doing the same thing. So that's in the game, that in the early situations you can't do that. Then the French get to do it briefly alone, and then both sides are doing it. But you get to see, at least in my model, how that plays out. But there's a cost because you're dedicating more airframes to that, and if you don't have enough, then then you can't fulfill your other missions. Then there are not a huge number, but a few asset cards that each side has that represent different tactical innovations or pieces of equipment or something like that. that's there as well. But the large innovation of using aircraft in an integrated way as part of a larger combined arms battle plan to deny the enemy the ability to look down on you while gaining it for your side to look down on him. That was from the beginning. I mean, the Germans had a pre-planned and they massed aircraft. They figured they had a plan to enact all of this, and it worked well. It was a big dedication of effort. It worked well. They achieved essentially successful surprise, and the French had not been able to look at what the Germans were up to because the Germans built whole rail lines and huge like not yeah, essentially tunnel complexes, giant bunkers called Stollen to hide their troops, and amassed all that, the largest number of guns ever assembled, the largest number of shells, and all that. Anyways, they did all that, denying the French the ability to see what they were doing, etc. But that was right at the beginning, right? So it's not like you're going to get to see that in Drachen because Drachen's scope really is the each side's offensives back and forth because now the reconnaissance battle is on. Because what happened was, it turns out air forces are very easy to quickly shift to a threatened point of your front. And the French, within a couple of weeks or something, had also, but it was okay, fine. They were able to move their aircraft to Verdun rather faster than they were able to get more infantry up the Voie Sacrée, to hold the line, right? The air reserve moved very quickly. And so the French were quite effective at denying, after only a short period of time, denying the Germans the air superiority that the Germans had so intricately set up. Then that swung back and forth. But again, with innovations, the French developed an aerial rocket to shoot down the Drachen, the balloons. It's a problem with shooting down balloons. You think it's a balloon, and it's full of hydrogen. How isn't that like the most vulnerable thing possible? You can't hide it. It's up there in the air. The problem was with the bullets that guns had. All you do is if you shot at the balloon, it would just poke some small holes in the balloon. The balloon would start leaking, and so eventually it's going to come down. But meanwhile, that plane that's attacked that balloon is going to be shot down by close anti-aircraft guns and chased down or whatever. Very dangerous mission because the balloons were so valuable because they were so effective for this reconnaissance, right? That they were very well defended. So you get to see that in the game. And later, they got incendiary bullets that did better, but the French came up with these rockets called Le Prieur. I mean, your French pronunciation probably can correct that. But when they did their offensive, that first offensive I mentioned in the late spring, they started out with flying a bunch of these. I think they're probably on Newport 11s or whatever, but these little fast fighters in on the balloons, and they fired the rockets, and the rockets would set these balloons on fire, and they shot a whole bunch of them down. So that's like a card in the game. Um, Anyways, so just so just to show that the name of the game Drachen does relate to something. These balloons are probably your single most valuable asset because they are so effective at looking down on the enemy
Yeah.
and seeing what they're doing and guiding your artillery.
Yeah, would they be just putting maps on a little thing and ride the rope down to the bottom, or how did they get their
Oh, it's
messages?
pretty. See, this is the great thing. If you're doing reconnaissance from an airplane, an aeroplane, and at first you didn't have a radio, they were doing that. The plane would fly out, write something down, come back to the front of the lines and throw it out, just throw it out of the cockpit, right? And the ground folks would signal the plane with panels on the ground, like white sheets or whatever, right? And you do it that way. Eventually, and this is already coming in the time of Verdun, the observation aircraft would have a transmitter, so it would be one way. So the mission was you'd cooperate with a given battery or whatever. You'd fly out and you'd say, okay, the plane could say, target blah, blah, blah. Here's the coordinate, angle, fire. Okay, correct the fire to here. Okay, fire for effect, right? It wouldn't be receiving anything back, but that was, that was good enough. With a balloon, you're tethered, right? You don't need wireless. So, of course, all over the battlefield are telephone cables, right? And the problem was in trench warfare, they're always getting cut by artillery or whatever. But the balloon's on a tether. You can run a telephone cable up the balloon. So now you've got right at the base of the balloon is probably your little command post or whatever's using that information and relaying that to artillery batteries or whatever it is. So it's really quite nice to because you're hooked up. You're hooked up. Now the problem with balloons was because balloons, of course, went way back to the French Revolution or whatever they were already using balloons. But a problem with balloons was the balloon, you fill the sack, it's the spherical ball of the hot air or hydrogen or whatever it was. And if you ever seen a kid's balloon in the wind, it's like, it's doing this, like it's going back and forth, right?
Especially at
And
those
what
altitudes.
yeah, and so if there's just the smallest amount of breeze, first of all, your binoculars are just getting shook up. You can't see anything. And second, you're probably getting airsick if you're the observer in the balloon. That was a problem. So it was actually the Germans or the Austrians or both together. I think it was the Germans who came up with this idea of this like sausage shaped thing that had like an air sac on it and little vanes, little like little wings of fabric, and it would point into the wind, and it would actually angle like a kite. So the word Drachen in German means dragon, but that's not the meaning here. It also means kite, like a kid's kite, because these balloons were kite balloons. They were aloft not only by being lighter than air, but also by the wind blowing against them. And the great thing about that is they could point into the wind, angle themselves properly, and they were stable. And now you could go up 1,000 meters or whatever, up high, and even in wind, you would have a steady platform for your observations. And they could see 15 miles if the weather's good. You can see from one balloon, you'd see the whole, pretty much the whole Verdun battlefield, but then of course they have several balloons working. So it was a very effective, and unfortunately for the cause of the Central Powers, this technology that they came up with before the war, they exported it. So they had sold it to everybody already when the war started. So so the French had them too. But a very, very interesting technology. And then the focus of a lot of daring do, because you get aces who are balloon busting aces, who are specialized in going in through all the defenses and shooting down. So this is a major activity in Drachen is how many balloons do you put up? Where do you put them? And then how do you protect them? And how do you go after the enemy's balloons, and how well does that go?
Yeah, and so you built all that into the game. It's mostly balloon busting missions and so forth. That's a
So
big part
balloon
of it.
busting missions are in there.
Yeah.
And yacht or French would be chasse would be the fighter missions where you're going out actually looking to shoot down enemy planes. And of course the observer missions, right? All of that is in there. And you've got your airframes, and that's the resolution. So in the Recon series, in each volume, there are no dice. For a variety of reasons, it's chit pull that resolves when there's some kind of enemy contact, right? Where we have some randomness to resolve. And in Coast Watchers, it's the Japanese searching for the Coast Watchers, and it's the Coast Watchers attempting to make deliveries into enemy territory that either of those can go well or poorly, can go awry. And that's like key activities by each side. There's a little pot of chits for each of that. Okay, so in Drachen, one of those is for air missions. And we use very similar chit pull mechanic to resolve the yacht, the airplane versus airplane, the balloon busting, and the observer missions. by pulling little air patrols and little sky markers out of these cups. And then each side can manipulate their chances by feeding that cup, with more of their airframes. But if you're doing that, you're basically dedicating your aeroplanes to a general, patrols over the battlefield rather than specific dedicated missions. And so you're running out of overall airframes, possibly, depending on how well endowed you are with those. And of course, you're taking losses as you're doing all that. So that's like a key player activity because it's so important. And so what I'm trying to get at here is we have, I mean, did you watch Blue Max when you were a kid, the movie Blue Max with George? It's like what, Blue Max, this is what World War One is about, right? It's these, jousts in the air between these individual aces. And we looked at games, there was Milton Bradley's Dogfight,
Yeah.
and then, Avalon Hill's Richthofen's War. Just look
And
at
Knights of the Air.
1972.
I
Yeah, it's
actually own
all
Knights of the Air.
Knights of the Air. And that
I,
was the concept, Knights of the Air, right? Was and people at the time, these were big heroes, they were glamorized. When one of the most famous German pilots died, Immelmann, the other one, Börke, who was serving at Verdun, he was withdrawn from the battle because the German authorities figured it would be too much of a morale loss if we got our second great knight of the air, shut down or whatever. Anyway, so they were important from a propaganda point of view, for sure. But I always wonder, like, what? Okay, so it's very small numbers of people in aircraft. I mean, you're concentrating at most a few hundred of airframes of all type for a given offensive or something. And so they're going up and they're jousting and they're shooting these machine guns at each other. So what? Like, how did this influence the war? Right. And so the operational level of wargaming kind of answers questions like that. Right. You know, Tactically, we can have a tank duel, but why does this tank duel matter to conquest of territory or whatever it is, or defense of territory? Well, you have to kind of step back and look operationally. And it's the same thing here. These aerial jousts mattered because if you could keep the enemy fighters at bay, then you were the one whose observer airplanes, the important airplanes, right, for the mission of trench warfare, had the ability to fly over top of the enemy's head and look down and correct artillery fire or take photographs of trench works or observe concentrations of guns or whatever it was, right? You got to do that and your enemy didn't if your knights of the air were more successful, right? That's what it's about. So that's what Drachen is trying to show. How does it fit into a battle?
yeah.
Why does it matter? And yeah, and an inspiration for that for me came from a game that your colleague Flash mentioned in his World War One ladder, and that is Kurt Keckley's Fields of Despair.
Yeah.
And have you played that?
I haven't no, but yeah.
So watch his video.
Yes. Okay, I
Talk
will do.
about it.
I'll
Just
check it out.
because he gives it good pride of place, and I'm so glad he included it because it has a lot to say about trench warfare. So it's a little bit more strategic. You're looking at the whole Western Front. It covers the whole war on the Western Front. It covers production and technology, and similarly, as it happens, not with chit pull, but with bag pull of cubes. It covers the naval warfare and the Russian front as well, abstractly in those ways. And it is a block game. It's like a classic Columbia block game, but Kurt pushes the ability of the stand-up blocks to hide force strength. I think he just pushes it to the maximum. In fact, the way he did it, I first saw it, I said, this isn't going to work. Players, are not going to, they're just going to go around this. And how he does that is each space along your front can hold up to 3 blocks. And each of those blocks can be anywhere from a dummy, 0 troops, to a strength of 20. I mean, 3 blocks could be a 3, a 5, and a 17, or a 20 and a 20 and a 20, or a 0 and a 0 and a 0. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like usually with block games, and this is something that with Hunt for Blackbeard in the Recon series, I'm tried to do blocks a little bit different to get on this this feature that usually with block games, you don't know exactly what the enemy units are, but you can see them moving around.
Yeah.
You can know for sure at this particular intersection, there's nothing because there's no blocks there. Over here, there's 5 blocks. They're probably not all dummies. There's probably more in this 5 block space than this 1 block, and so forth. In Fields of Despair, the whole front is covered in blocks. It's World War I on the Western Front. There's troops everywhere. And typically, the whole front is covered with 3 blocks each space along the front. Okay. And now, once a turn, both players, this is the part I didn't think would work, but it actually works great. Once a turn, both players can freely rearrange those numbers on those blocks up and down their front any way they like. So I can suddenly take and mass a huge force in front of Verdun, and you won't know. Now, think of that. Going back to Nick Carp in Vietnam and being able to take any U.S. reinforcements you wanted at any time, that's freedom. That's agency. Well, it's that way here, too, in Fields of Despair. If you want to leave a part of your front naked and hope the enemy doesn't realize it so you can mass a big offensive over here, go for it, man. See what happens. Brilliant. And here's the important part. Then the air warfare in Kurt's game, you're battling it out between your biplanes over a given hex, given little sector of the front. And what do you get if you win? You get to
Recon
look,
information.
yes, you get to look at the enemy's blocks. Now imagine how valuable that is in
Yeah.
this context where he has provided you this vast uncertainty. Boy, I really, before I launch my offensive, wouldn't I like to know how strong the enemy is there? Or if I suspect the enemy's going to be launching an offensive, wouldn't I like to see what he's got there? And that was a really, really key insight for me about trench warfare and reconnaissance. Because what was the situation? What was so different about mountains to the sea, continuous fortified lines, the Western Front, in the face of barbed wire, machine guns, fast bolt action rifles, and artillery, fast firing artillery, and masses of it, the horseman was out of business, right?
Yeah.
And okay, fine. So we think about, you couldn't do a cuirassier charge to break the enemy line or whatever, chase down the Imperial Guard. What the horsemen had really been important for forever until 1914 was reconnaissance. That's how armies figured out where the enemy was, right? And sometimes where their own guys were, right? Is they sent horsemen out, because they could go fast, they could observe, and they'd come back. So you get light cavalry. That's what they're mainly about, right? It's information. Not going to happen on the Western Front.
Yeah.
So suddenly, everything I know about you and what you're massing is just what I can see on the next hill, next ridge, like 100 meters in front of me. Behind that, you might have a huge army or nothing. I don't know, unless I can get up in the air and look down on you, right? And as chance would have it, they had just come up with powered aircraft and airplanes and Drachen, these stable observation balloons, and so they developed that. But Verdun's already more than a year in. They're developing their tactics to use that new technology to replace light horse reconnaissance, right? So Kurt's game tells you that story, right? And I thought, wow, I'd like to zoom in on that. So in Kurt's game, you're playing the whole Western Front, you're playing possibly several years of the war, and you're going to play out one air battle where you're each contributing some air units and you fight out a little battle to see who gets to look at the blocks there. that's what I want to zoom in and show, you know, operationally, right, rather than strategically, is what are the ins and outs of that decisive air battle to be able to look at the enemy blocks, which is
Mhm.
exactly what you're doing in Drachen. You're looking at, the main thing you want to be able to do is look at the enemy blocks and shoot at them.